are you students? This is grade 12 economics lesson provided by the Ministry of Education of Ethiopia, and it is on unit 2, which is about aggregate demand and aggregate supply analysis, and this is the second lesson, which is about aggregate supply. The objectives of this lesson are: at the end of this lesson you will be able to define concept of aggregate supply, describe the basic determinants of aggregate supply, distinguish the difference between a change in the quantity supplied and change in supply. In the previous lesson, we saw aggregate demand, which is the total amount that economic agents are willingly spend in a given period, since it is measured by the total expenditure of the economy, community on goods and services. The four components of the aggregate demand are: consumption spending made by households, the gross domestic private investment, government expenditure, and net export, which is the difference between the values of export and import. Today we are going to see the aggregate supply, which refers to the quantity supplied of all goods and services, or real GDP, at various prices levels, ceteris paribus. There is a direct relationship between the aggregate quantity supplied and the general price level. That means as the general price level increases, then the aggregate quantity supplied will increase, and with the fall in the general price level, then the aggregate quantity supplied will decline. So due to this direct relationship between the general price level and the aggregate quantity supplied, or real GDP quantity supplied, then the slope of the aggregate supply curve is positive. The aggregate supply curve shows the quantity supplied of all goods and services, or real GDP, or output, at different price levels, ceteris paribus. The amount of output firms are willing to supply depends on the price they receive for their goods and the amount which they have to pay for labor and other factors of production or resources which are used to produce the commodities or used to provide the services by firms. There are different types of aggregate supply curve called the Keynesian aggregate supply curve, the classical aggregate supply curve, and the long run aggregate supply curve. Let's start with the Keynesian aggregate supply curve, which is a horizontal straight line aggregate supply curve. The Keynesian aggregate supply curve is a horizontal, and it indicates that firms will supply whatever amount of goods is demanded at the existing price level, since there is unemployment according to the Keynesian aggregate supply curve. So firms can obtain much labor if there is unemployment with the ongoing wage rate or nominal wage rates. The average cost of production are constant as output level changes. The average cost of production is the total cost per unit of output produced, and hence there is constant average cost according to the Keynesian supply curve. This is the Keynesian aggregate supply curve, which is a horizontal straight line aggregate supply curve. This indicates that any amount or any quantity of a commodity is supplied by this given price, by a given price. The other aggregate supply curve is the classical aggregate supply curve, which is a vertical aggregate supply curve. Then the classical aggregate supply curve is vertical due to the following assumption: the same amount of goods will be supplied whatever the price level, since the labor market is always in equilibrium with full employment of the labor force. This is the classical aggregate supply curve. This fixed amount of a commodity is supplied regardless of changes in price at P0, at P1, or at P2. So this is the classical aggregate supply curve. The upward sloping aggregate supply curve, also called the short run aggregate supply curve. This is, before we are going to see the upward sloping or the short run aggregate supply curve, let's see the difference between the short run and the long run. The short run is a time horizon in which the quantity of at least one of the inputs used in production remains fixed. Fixed inputs are those inputs whose quantity do not vary as the level of output vary, and variable inputs are those inputs whose quantity do vary as the level of output vary. So in the short run, the quantity of at least one of the inputs used in production remains fixed. But in the long run, all the inputs used in production are variable. Now let's see the short run aggregate supply curve, SRAS. It shows the quantity supplied of all goods and services or real GDP or output at different price levels, ceteris paribus. And the short run aggregate supply curve is upward sloping due to the direct relationship between the real GDP quantity supplied and the general price level. That means as the general price level increases, then the real GDP quantity supplied or the aggregate quantity supplied will increase, and with the fall in the general price level, then the quantity supplied of real GDP or the aggregate supply will decline. So due to this direct relationship between the general price level and the real GDP quantity supplied, then the slope of the short run aggregate supply curve is positive, or there is direct relationship between general price and aggregate supply. Here is the general price level and the real domestic product or the real GDP quantity supplied. So with the rise in the general price level, the real GDP quantity supplied will also increase, and with the fall in the price level, the real GDP quantity supplied will decline. Why is the short run aggregate supply curve upward sloping or positively sloped? The direct relationship and the resulting upward slope of the short run aggregate supply curve is explained by sticky weights and workers' misperceptions. When we say sticky weights, weights are not flexible or simply locked in for a few years due to labor contract agreements. That means there is no change in the wage that the laborers or workers can get from the employers. So one of the reasons why the short run aggregate supply curve is positively sloped is sticky wage or inflexible wage. Let's see the real wage. Real wage is a measure of the purchasing power of income, specifically wage, and mathematically the real wage is calculated by dividing the nominal wage for the price level. And let's see the relationship between the price level and real wage. With the rise in the price level, then the real wage will always decline, but if there's a fall in the price level, then the real wage will increase. By taking these pointers, let's see the other pointers on the sticky wage. The real wage reflects the actual amount of goods and services that can be bought with a given amount of nominal wage after accounting for inflation. That means the real wage is our wage which is not affected by inflation. When we see the relationship between the quantity supplied and the real wage, with the rise in the real wage, then the quantity supplied of real wage will also increase, and because workers are attracted by rise in the real wage and they will supply more of their labor. But if there's a fall in the real wage, then they will be discouraged and they will supply less of their labor. So there is direct relationship between the real wage rates and the supply of labor. When we see the demand for labor, with the rise in the real wage, then producers or farmers are willing to buy less labor, so the supply of labor will decline. But with the fall in the real wage rates, then the supply of labor will increase. So there is an inverse relationship between the real wage rates and the supply of labor. As I told you, one of the causes for the direct relationship between the general price level and the real GDP quantity supplied is sticky wage. If wages are sticky or locked in, a decrease in the price level pushes real wage up. That means if there is a fall in the price level, then the real wage will increase, and there is an inverse relationship between the real wage and the quantity demanded of labor. That means if there is a rise in the real wage, then the demand for labor will decline, and hence farmers will supply less of a commodity, and finally then the real GDP quantity supplied or the aggregate supply will decline. So with the fall in the price level, the aggregate supply will decline. Conversely, if there is a rise in price of goods and services, then the purchasing power of wage or the real wage will decline, and if there is a fall in the real wage, then the demand for labor will increase, and if there is a rise in the demand for labor, then farmers will increase their supply, hence the aggregate supply will increase. So there is direct relationship between the price level and aggregate supply. That means as price increases, aggregate supply will increase. So this is the reason why the aggregate supply curve is positively sloped, or simply there is direct relationship between real GDP quantity supplied and the general price level. The second reason why there is a direct relationship between the general price level and the real GDP quantity supplied is workers' misperception. Workers may misperceive real wage changes. Suppose workers mistakenly believe the real wage has fallen. But the reality is rise in the real wage. By default, by mistake, they perceive that the real wage has fallen, but the reality is the real wage is increasing. Increase in the real wage means there's a fall in the price of goods and services. If there's a fall in the price of goods and services, then the supply for labor will decline, and if there's a fall in the supply of labor, then the aggregate supply will decline. Hence, with the fall in the price level, then the aggregate supply will decline. So one of the reasons for the direct relationship between the general price level and the real GDP quantity supplied is workers' misperception. Let's rush to the other lesson, which is about the change in quantity supplied versus change in aggregate supply. The change in quantity supplied is a movement along the short-run aggregate supply curve, and which is caused by a change in the price of the goods or service itself only. And as the price level increases, then the aggregate quantity supplied or the real GDP quantity supplied will increase, and with the fall in the price level, then the aggregate supply or the real GDP quantity supplied will decline. Here is the graph. The graph shows that with the change in the price level, there is a movement along a fixed aggregate supply curve. Let's take this as P0 and this one as P1, and let's take this as Q0 and this one as Q1. Here, as the price increase from P0 to P1, then the real GDP quantity supplied will increase from Q0 to Q1, and it's a movement from point A to point B. And when the price falls from P1 to P0, then the real GDP quantity supplied will decline from Q1 to Q0. It's a movement from point A to B. So with the change in the general price level, there is a movement along a fixed aggregate supply curve from one point to another on a fixed aggregate supply curve. Change in aggregate supply is caused by change in other factors other than the general price level. And these factors other than the price level shifts the aggregate supply curve either to the left or to the right from its entire position. Those factors that increases aggregate supply will shift the aggregate supply curve to the right, and those factors that reduces aggregate supply will shift the aggregate supply curve to the left. Let's see these factors affecting the short-run aggregate supply curve. The first one is change in productivity. If there's a rise in the productivity, then the aggregate supply will increase, but if there's a fall in the productivity, aggregate supply will decline. And the other determinant is state of technology. If farmers employ advanced technology, then the aggregate supply will increase, but if the farmers employ backward technology, then aggregate supply will decline. And the other determinant is business taxes. if government imposes higher taxes on businesses, then the aggregate supply will decline. But with the fall in business taxes imposed by the government on investors, then the aggregate supply will increase. So there is inverse relationship between business tax and aggregate supply. The third one is subsidies. If government increases subsidy, then aggregate supply will increase. But if there is a fall in the subsidies, aggregate supply will decline. And the fourth one is weather. More specifically for agricultural products, if there is good weather condition, then the aggregate supply for agricultural products will increase, and with bad weather condition, then the aggregate supply for the agricultural outputs will decline. Let's see the other type of supply curve called the vertical aggregate supply curve, which is also called the long run aggregate supply curve. As explained earlier, the reasons for an upward sloping short run aggregate supply curve are sticky waste and workers' misperception. It follows then the short run equilibrium identifies the real GDP where the economy produces when either of these two conditions hold. But in the long run, wastes are not sticky. They are flexible. In the long run, aggregate supply curve with the vertical line at the level of natural real GDP, and this is the natural real GDP. But in the long run, waste will become flexible and misperception. There was misperception in the short run aggregate supply curve, but there is no misperception, or simply there is accurate perception in the long run aggregate supply curve. In the long run, the economy produces the full employment real GDP or the natural real GDP. In the aggregate supply curve that identifies the outputs the economy produces in the long run is the long run aggregate supply, which is LRAS curve. And the long run equilibrium identifies the level of real GDP that the economy produces when wages and prices have adjusted to their final equilibrium levels and there are no misperception on the part of the workers. And the level of real GDP that the economy produces in the long run equilibrium is the natural real GDP, or QN graphically, as you saw in the previous slides. Let me give you exercises, students. The first question is, the economy produces the full employment real GDP or the natural real GDP under A. long run aggregate supply, B. short run aggregate supply, C. Keynesian aggregate supply curve, D. classical aggregate supply curve. Question number 2. The direct relationship and the resulting upward slope of the short run aggregate supply curve is caused by A. sticky wages, B. workers' accurate perceptions, C. flexible wages, D. equilibrium in the labor market. Question number 3. A movement along a fixed aggregate supply curve is caused by change in A. business tax, B. real interest rate, C. the general price level, D. technology. Welcome back, students. Let's do the exercises together. The first one is, the economy produces the full employment real GDP or the natural real GDP under. The answer is long run aggregate supply. Question number 2. The direct relationship and the resulting upward slope of the short run aggregate supply curve is caused by sticky wages is the answer. The answer is A. The direct relationship and the resulting upward slope of the short-run aggregate supply curve is caused by sticky weights or inflexible weights and workers' misperception, not accurate perception. When we see the other distractors, B it says workers' accurate perception, there is workers' misperception, no accurate perceptions. When we see C, flexible weights, weights are not flexible, they are sticky due to some labor contracts or agreements, and it is not caused by equilibrium in the labor market, hence D is not the answer. Question number 3. A movement along a fixed aggregate supply curve is caused by change in A. business tax, B. real interest rates, C. the general price level, D. technology. The answer is C, the general price level. The single factor that makes a movement along a fixed short-run aggregate supply curve is change in the general price level only. Other factors other than the general price level shifts the aggregate supply curve either to the left or to the right from its entire position. For example, business tax shifts the aggregate supply curve either to the left or to the right. The real interest rates shifts the aggregate supply curve either to the left or to the right, and even technology shifts the aggregate supply curve either to the left or to the right. Students, let's summarize the day's lesson. Aggregate supply refers to the quantity supplied of all goods and services or real GDP at various price levels, ceteris paribus. And the Keynesian aggregate supply curve is a horizontal aggregate supply curve indicating that any amount of a product is supplied regardless of changes in the general price level. The classical aggregate supply curve is vertical, and it indicates that a fixed amount of a product is supplied regardless of changes in the general price level, and the short-run aggregate supply curve is upward sloping. That is, there is direct relationship between general price and the real GDP quantity supplied. Students, this is all about the day's lesson. Thank you.